Hello everyone, I'm Diann Morgan. Welcome to World Class Sunday School. We're so glad you could join us for today's Sunday School lesson. The title of our lesson is Love in Difficult Times. Our print passage, Luke 15th chapter, the 11th through the 24th verse. This lesson today is coming from the parable that was taught by Jesus that we commonly call the prodigal son. It's written by Luke, who was a contemporary of the Apostle Paul. I want to start from the first verse in Luke rather than going straight to the 11th verse because it'll give you some background on how we landed at today's lesson. And today's lesson is a wonderful lesson. I know those of us who've been going to church for a very long time, when we were young children, we always were taught the parables that Jesus spoke, but oftentimes we didn't know the significance of those parables. They sounded good, but we didn't know the significance of those parables. So I hope that today's lesson will give you just a glimpse of what Jesus was really talking about, what he was ministering about. So let's get started. Let me start reading. Luke 15, verse 1. Then all the tax collectors and the sinners drew near to him to hear him. You hear that? All the sinners and the tax collectors drew near to Jesus so they could hear him. The people who were religious, they didn't want to hear what Jesus had to say, but the tax collectors and the sinners did. And the Pharisees and scribes complained, saying, "This man receives sinners and eats with them," as if they were saying that the sinners and the tax collectors were not good enough to be in Jesus' company. That's the reason Jesus was sent here, was to save us from our sins. So if he was never in our company, then he could not save us. And Jesus knew that. He understood his assignment. So he spoke this parable to them, saying, "What man of you, having 100 sheep, if he loses one of them, does not leave the 99 in the wilderness and go after the one which is lost until he finds it?" 100 sheep is a lot of sheep. Keep in mind that sheep was very valuable during that time. I'm sure sheep are very valuable during this time, but they were very valuable. So even the loss of one sheep could be a financial burden to that person. And Jesus said, "And when he has found it, he lays it on his shoulders, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends, his neighbors, and he says to them, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep, which was lost.' I say to you that likewise there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 just people who need no repentance." So God is looking for the unsaved. If we're already saved, our job is to seek out the unsaved so that they can be saved too, so that we can all rejoice and have a good time because someone else joined our ranks. Someone else got saved. So the next parable is the parable of the lost coin. These two parables are leading up to today's lesson. "Or what woman having 10 silver coins," and when I did some research, one silver coin is worth a drachma back in that day. And a drachma was equal to a day's wage. So if you lost one silver coin, you lost a day's pay. Just think about your check. If you lost 8 hours of pay, that would make you kind of sad because you worked hard for that 8 hours and you don't want to just lose it. So it says, "If she loses one coin, does not light a lamp, sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it. And when she has found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together, saying, 'Rejoice with me, for I have found the piece which I lost.'" She had found the coin. "Likewise, I say unto you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents." So Jesus repeats this. It's very important that we get this, that we should rejoice when even just one person gets saved. We don't have to have 100 to come down to the altar today, but just one person is worth being joyful, rejoicing, saying hallelujah, because Jesus said it. I didn't say it. It's right here in his word in Luke the 15th chapter, to rejoice when even just one soul comes to Christ. So for today's lesson, the parable of the lost son, also commonly known as the prodigal son. Now, I don't know about you, but as a child, when I read this parable of the prodigal son, or was told to me, I thought it meant that that this son was well favored, that the daddy loved him more than the other son. I didn't realize prodigal meant wayward, wasteful. That's what prodigal means. So we're going to talk a lot more about the prodigal son. Before I get into the verses, let me read just a little bit from our introduction. As a reminder, Jesus is teaching. He's teaching that it's important to try to save as many people as we can. But even if we can help save one person, we've done a lot. It's so important that we are willing to sit at the feet of Jesus and learn. Be like Mary, just sit there and take in what Jesus is saying. I know that some of us have a Martha spirit. I'm guilty of that as well. But it's so important to sit and be ministered to and learn from the word. So Luke's main reason for writing this passage is found in chapters 14, 15, and 16. As Luke shares the stories of a shepherd who has lost his sheep, a woman who has lost her corn, and a father who has lost his son. We call him the prodigal son. All instances of loss are of great significance. There's a time of rejoicing not only by the one who has directly experienced the loss, but by the entire community. If you remember when the man found his sheep, when the woman found her corn, they went to their friends, their kinspeople, and to their neighbors, rejoicing. So when we read today's lesson, we're going to find out what the father did when his wayward son came back home. So let's begin reading the scriptures, and then we will get to the meat and the foundation of what our lesson is about. Verse number 11. Then Jesus said, there's a man who had two sons. Remember, Jesus is teaching. The younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. So he divided his property between them. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country. Some translations say a far country. And there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent, verse 14, when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. That's our first paragraph, and it's talking about the son's departure. Let's break this down a little bit more. A man's son came to him asking if he could have his share of his inheritance. That's pretty bold, because an inheritance means that somebody has died. So the son is already wanting his share of the inheritance. Now listen to what is going to happen. So this is unusual for a couple of reasons. First, he was the younger of two sons. The greater portion of the inheritance at that time always went to the older son. The younger son was usually entitled to a third of the inheritance. But the younger son knew he would be entitled to some portion of his father's goods, and he decided at his young age, that he probably was in his teens or maybe very early 20s, that he wanted to go out and to explore the world. And he wanted to find out what life was like away from the safety and sanctity of where his father lived. But some things are going to happen to him, which we'll read about very shortly. As the younger son, he would have been entitled to a lesser portion of his father's inheritance, with a greater portion going to the older brother. And there was an older brother, and we will introduce him to you toward the end of the lesson. Secondly, he asked for his inheritance before his father's death. An inheritance should be paid out upon the death of the father in normal circumstances. But that is not what happened in this case. So let's quickly travel back through the verses. Verse 11, then Jesus said, there was a man who had 2 sons. Verse 12, the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me. He's already decided that a share of his dad's property, his dad's earnings, belonged to him. That's pretty bold, pretty audacious of him to even say that to his dad, especially a young man. So his father divided his property between them, between his 2 sons, with the bigger portion going to the older son. A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had. He couldn't have had that much. He'd been living in his parents' home, and he just received whatever portion of inheritance he was going to get. But he gathered it all up. And I imagine he felt pretty proud of himself. He probably felt very important. And he traveled to a distant country. He didn't want to be around his family. I imagine because he felt like he was grown and that he could do his own thing, that he could make his own mistakes, and he could do whatever he was big and bad enough to do. But oh, we're going to find out just how big and bad he was. And there he squandered his property. He wasted it. The scriptures don't tell us how long it took for him to waste it, but we know that he did. In verse 14, when he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout the country, and he began to be in need. Now, the famine came about in 2 ways. One, the country experienced famine, but 2, this wayward prodigal son also experienced famine, because had he had money or some of his goods that his father had given him, perhaps he could have traveled somewhere else and continued to spend money. So he had a famine in his life. Do you have a famine in your life? Are you without God? You could look at it in that respect and say, if I am without God, then I have a famine in my life. As the son receives his father's inheritance, he heads out on his own. He squanders all that he had, and then a famine took place. Things go from bad to worse, as the famine caused him to be in need, and likely he had never been in need before, because he had been living with his parents, under the roof of his father, living in the lap of luxury, enjoying all that his father owned, because as a son, his father loved him and would allow him to eat, drink, and be merry at home. But nope, that wasn't enough for him. He wanted all his worldly goods right then and there. He did not want to defer gratification. He didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted to go out into the world and find out what it was about. And as we travel through the scriptures, that is just what is going to happen to him. This portion of the story helps to teach the lesson that we should not live at or beyond our means, because we never know when hard times might come. That's happened to many people, where they live at or above their means, where they go out and buy a Gucci bag when a Walmart bag will do, where they go out and get red bottom shoes when Payless shoes will do, based on their income or based on how much money they have. So they're living above their means. But when it's time for the rent to be paid, or the car note, or the utility bill to be paid, they can't pay that with that Gucci bag or those red bottom shoes. So the next thing you know, they're put out of the house, the utility are turned off, the phone is turned off, and a famine occurs in their life. Hard times can find all of us. Even if we are unlike this lost son and do not engage in dissolute living, we can still fall on hard times. But when we fall on hard times, what do? We pray to our Father, because our Father has many, many, many mansions. Our Father owns a cattle on 1,000 hills. Our Father lives in a place whose halls are paved with golds and fine jewels. So we would need to call on God and believe that God will come to our rescue. So the son should have never asked his living father for his inheritance. His focus should have been on spending as much time with his father as opposed to leaving. When you spend time with your father, you can learn some things. You can learn it by talking to him, by watching how he lives his life. You can learn by asking him to teach you how to be a good steward over your money. Find out how your dad amassed his fortune. And that's how you learn how to live a life worthy of being God's child. So we learn by reading Jesus' word, by studying daily, by assembling ourselves with like-minded people. It's so important that we remember that. Our second outline, the son's return. Luke 15th chapter, the 15th through the 20th verse. Now, the prodigal son is about to learn a valuable lesson. If you remember, I just told you he should have spent his time talking with his father, watching his father, trying to be like his father, mostly trying to learn from his father, but he didn't. So verse 15, so he, talking about the son, went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. Remember, in the last outline, he had gotten all his inheritance. He had gone to a far country. He had been eating, drinking, and being merry, having a good time, going into the bars and saying, set it up, giving everybody a drink on him, buying everybody a meal, being the most popular person in the room. But now he needs somebody. So let's see what's going to happen. Verse 15, read it again. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country. Remember, he's in a foreign country. He's probably not even in a country with people who are part of his religion. And here's why. Because the citizen sent him to his fields to feed the pigs. This young man was likely of Jewish faith. And we know that the Jews had no dealing with swines. But when you get down on your luck, when you got no other way to eat, you'll do almost anything. So here's what happened next. And he would gladly have filled himself with the pods, the husk, that hard part that people would throw out into the pig pen or the slop pen. It says he would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating. Oh, he must have been very hungry. It couldn't have been much taste of that, because that was probably the leftover from maybe corn or wheat. Very tough. A pig's stomach is very tough. Very tough. And those of you out there who eat chitlins, you know you might find some husk pod in the chitlin. So make sure you clean them really good. So it says, and no one gave him anything. This is the same young man early on that had a lot of money, was good friends to everybody, was giving everybody something to drink, was feeding everybody, and was making everybody merry. Now look what's happening to him. He's in the pig pen of life. I want you to check yourself and make sure that you're not destined or headed to a life of famine. You're not headed to the pig pen of life. Jesus doesn't want you to be there. Jesus wants you to continue to wear your royal linen and wear your beautiful robes and to eat at fine dining tables. But that will not happen if you forsake learning about Jesus. If you forsake the word, you will not have the right to that fine table, supping with Jesus. Verse 17. Of all the verses that we read, this is the one that stuck to me the most. But when he came to himself, he said, when he came to himself, he's out there. First he asked his daddy for his money. His daddy gave it to him. Then he's eating, drinking, being merry, having a good time. And then he spent all that he had. And a famine hit. So now the people he's been hanging out with, they don't have anything, and he doesn't have anything. And the little they have, they are not willing to share. And remember, he went a far distance from home, so he doesn't have any kin near him. He doesn't have any friends near him. He's just got himself. But one thing he remembered is although he's in a far land that struck by famine, it dawned on him, I have a family. So here's what he said. He came to himself. He said, how many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat? But here I am dying of hunger. How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough to eat? But here I am dying of hunger. He remembers how kind his father was, how his father took care of his servants, that he made sure that everybody had enough to eat. And they had a good portion. And they had fresh bread to eat. They didn't have hard leftover bread. They were not eating out of the slop pen of life like he was. But he had to come to himself, because I'm sure when he first left home, he was high and mighty. He was whistling Dixie. But now, he's in the pig pen of life. His life is stricken with famine. But he came to himself. That's how we have to do as Christians. If you're in a backslidden condition, I beg of you to now come to yourself. Because Jesus is waiting. He's got his hand outstretched, asking for you to come back. I'm just waiting for you to come to yourself. That's what Jesus is saying to you. Verse 18, I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him. So he came to himself. And he's going with humility. He's not going to say, hey, Dad, don't you remember me? I'm your son. I know I wasted all my money, but hey, you're my dad. And that's the way some of you will do today. You'll go back home like your mother and your father owe you something. But make sure you check your attitude. Make sure you go back with humility. Because they won't stop loving you because you left home, because you spent all your goods that you were given. They will love you because you're their son. And that's the way Jesus is. Jesus will beckon you to come back because we are his own. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. So he knows what he did was wrong. First he said, I have sinned against heaven. So he had the humility to know that what he did wasn't right in God's eyesight. And it wasn't right in his father's eyesight. But he was humble. He didn't go as, I'm your son. He went as a servant. He said, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands. That's what I call humility. That's the way we have to address Jesus. Lord, thank you so much for saving me. I am not worthy. But if you will give me another chance, I will do better. And I'll be ever grateful to give you the glory. In verse 20, so he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion. He ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Now let's remember back in verse 17, this young man has an aha moment. That moment where you remember, this is what I should have done, that V8 moment. But his dad possibly had been looking for his son, longing for his son, hoping that his son will come back home. So after reaching the bottom, the son went and found a job. And remember I told you that job was working in a pig pen. He had to really have sunk to his very lowest. But when we sink to our very lowest, God will pick us up. That's when God can use us the most. It is important to note that the lost son also had no one to aid him in that country. But in his home country, he had a father who cared. So when we go out into the world, we don't have anybody to aid us. But when we come to ourselves and when we come back home, we know that we have a father who cares. After realizing how far he had fallen, the lost son had a conversation with himself. He started talking to himself saying, what am I doing? My father's got servants that eat much better than me. I'm going to go home and beg for my father's forgiveness and ask him to just treat me like a servant, because even the servants have more than I have. The last outline, the Father's compassion. Luke 15, verse 21 through 24. Then the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, quickly bring out a robe, the best one, and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. And get the fatted calf and kill it. And let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. And they began to celebrate. If you remember the story of the lost sheep, the story of the lost coin, everybody began to celebrate. So that's what will happen when we come back to Jesus. So when people come back to the church, it's important that we celebrate them. That we don't look down upon them. That we don't neglect taking them back into the fold. So let me finish by reading what his big brother said. Now his oldest son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called to one of the servants to ask what was going on. And the servant said, your little brother back. And it made the big brother angry. But the father told him, please don't be angry. You'll be getting everything that I have left. And everything he has is wasted. So I'm going to give him the best of what I can give him. But I can't give him a part of the inheritance. So if you want to be a part of Jesus' inheritance, wait for it. Do your very best to honor what Jesus has told us in his word. And make sure that you continue to sit at his feet all day, every day. Thank you so much for tuning in to today's Sunday school lesson. I hope that you all learned a lot.